Day and night, they take calls dealing with abuse, neglect, and exploitation of children in the care of the state of Texas and Child Protective Services. But what happened to the 173,000 calls that were simply abandoned because it took too long for the state intake hotline to answer them? Tonight, Yami Virhin investigates what happens to those calls and if anyone is following up with them.
They received more than 763,495 calls in 1 year. It's a state hotline that works around the clock.
These calls are life and death.
But it's the number of calls that are abandoned that never get to speak to anyone that now are being highlighted in the latest report from the federal court monitors overseeing the children in the care of Texas.
I couldn't go on reading them because they're so depressing. And what you see, what it reveals is a system where kids are not getting the help they really need.
Marshall Lowry is one of the attorneys in this case that has taken more than 10 years. It's a lawsuit that was brought on to protect the rights and safety of the more than 8,000 children in the care of the Department of Family Protective Services.
The state just doesn't seem to want to deal with it, despite the fact that a federal judge in 2015 found that children in this system were being harmed, and that they were worse when they left the system than when they entered it. I mean, this is a rich state that has a lot of funding, a lot of money is available, and they're not using it to help these kids. I can't figure out why.
Among the issues federal court monitors found the rate at which calls to the state's hotline are being abandoned. That means the caller hung up before anyone could hear their outcry or allegation.
Is that there have been a large number of basically lost reports. So the state receives calls to the so-called hotline, and there were 173,000 calls over the last year that had been lost, they had not been answered. They simply had not been answered.
According to the federal report, the average wait now for someone, possibly a child, to either have their call handled or abandoned is 5.6 minutes.
Because they had to wait so long, the people disconnected. And the state has no idea what the calls were about, whether the people ever who were calling to report, mandated reporters who are supposed to report that a child has potentially been harmed by somebody, and those calls are just not being answered.
And the reason all of these calls coming in are important is very clear from the data the court monitors analyze. Of the calls that were actually handled, 3,246 of these calls were coded by the intake call taker as allegations involving abuse, neglect, or exploitation, showing that these calls do matter, and if abandoned, could be leaving the most vulnerable children in Texas, quote, in unsafe situations for extensive periods of time with a shocking disregard for their suffering or the risk of harm they faced, end quote. For Lowry, the concern is for the children whose allegations were never reported at all because that call was abandoned.
More than 170,000 instances of kids who could be being harmed that potentially are not being investigated because the state doesn't even know whether the people ever call back. That is a really, really serious problem as well.
So they have no way to call them back at all? Like you dial 911 now and, if you hang up, they call you back? No?
Nope. The state does not have a system to track the calls of the people who have hung up. And the state said when they testified about it today, well, maybe the people call back, maybe they enter an online report. State has no way of knowing. Some of those calls are just lost forever.
The majority of the calls and intakes that are answered are for neglectful supervision. That accounts for 52%. Physical abuse, 28%, or 706 allegations. And sexual abuse was 162 intake cases, or 6% of the allegations.
And someplace out there, lots and lots of kids are being harmed, potentially harmed, we don't know for sure, potentially harmed, needs to be investigated.
Jami Virgen, Fox SA.